Hi, everyone. What I'm going to talk about today is the Dark Ages of Greece, and I've given you the dates here. Again, these are sort of ranges from 1100 to 800 BC. And I talked about this a little bit at the end of our last lecture um, in terms of what was happening with the fall of Mycenaean Greece. So again, we had to be careful with these dates, but it's around 1200. We see economies collapsing, the archaeological record, both of buildings and of the land, shows us that things were collapsing. Pottery, you get this beautiful pottery made before this period. That definitely gets reduced in terms of down to the basics. And of course, I had mentioned that Linear B, the governmental language, was forgotten during this period. It is interesting that we start to see the use of iron during this time. Now, before it was bronze, and bronze is a mix of metals. With trade collapsing, with the economy collapsing, you don't get these metals being brought into Greece very much, and iron is a natural metal. So starting around 1000 BC, which is the 11th century BC, we start to see iron being used. And after that, it becomes the metal of choice because it's a harder metal. We also see pottery start to be remade, and it's called proto-geometric. Let me just show you. Here's a picture of what this proto-geometric pottery looks like. It's still a beautiful shape, and you start to see some basic geometric designs. And here you can see sort of wavy lines and these half circles, lines that go all the way around the pottery. And again, I put the dates here. Here's another example of a proto-geometric pottery. Looks like almost the same thing, except this one's a little bit simpler. Now, what this is telling us is that people still had the technology to make pottery, and when you're making something that looks this nice, it means you have time to do it. So what it means is economies were probably starting to pick up just a little. And then between 9 and 700 BC, which is still considered to be in the Dark Ages, you have what's called geometric pottery. And you can see that this is much more detailed. You see sort of triangles, circles, squiggly lines, and so on. So you can see the progression from proto-geometric, which is the early type of pottery, to this pottery. And again, what this is telling you is that people have time to do it. So there must be farmers out there growing food that they are selling to people. People can buy their own food and then have time to do something like make a pot that looks really nice. We also, like thinking about in terms of what caused this, it's not really clear. I went over some things the other in our other lecture where I talked about earthquakes, invasions. Now, during this time, there was a lot of migration. And I had mentioned the Dorian movement or the Dorian invasion in the last lecture, where people are coming down from the northern part of Greece and Macedonia, which just sits north of Greece. And if you look up and read some of the primary texts from a period a little bit later, there are three groups of people that were coming in or were already living in Greece. These were the Dorians, which I just talked about, the Ionians, and the Aeolians. Now, it's not important. You don't need to memorize this, but what I've got here is a map showing where some of these people were probably going, and this is based on the archaeological record. So the Aeolians were coming down from the north and then possibly going over through the Aegean Sea. Then you've got the Ionians coming down a bit further, traveling over to Asia Minor, and then the Dorians coming all the way down, going to Crete, and then also moving into Asia Minor. Now, in terms of what Greek society looked like, so think about the Mycenae in particular, that great city-state that I spent some time showing you the other day with the large fortifications, the large buildings, these large gray circles. During the Dark Ages, settlements were much smaller. So there's an indication here that population was smaller. It dropped during the beginning of the Dark Age because of things collapsing. We do find evidence of a government. So you have early kings, and then later in some city-states, when they were redeveloping, there's something called an aristocracy, which means Aristos means the best. So a group of people who consider themselves to be the best governed then. And I put here power is kept by the elite, so the best were the elite. I'd already talked about how metal usage was happening during this period, which was iron. What's really interesting is as the Greeks were starting to spread out and travel through the Mediterranean, they came across other civilizations. One was the Phoenicians. And these people lived in modern day Palestine, Israel, that area. These people, these Phoenicians, they wrote. And it's really the writing system that we have today. So the Greeks picked that up. Now, remember, they forgot Linear B, so they weren't using Linear B anymore. They found this new writing system by the Phoenicians, and then they adopted it wholesale. Now, even though I've called this the Dark Ages, we know in some places of Greece, it actually wasn't all that bad. There is a place called Lefkandi, and let me show you some of the things that archaeologists have found there. This is, I know it's probably a little bit hard to see, but this is an outline of a building called Tumba. And this was found on a hill at Lefkandi. And I've given you the dimensions of this building. So 135 feet long, 30 feet wide, and it had a 15-foot door. And it dates to around 950 BC, which is sort of right in the middle of the Dark Ages. And what this is telling us is that even though this is considered to be the Dark Age, not everything was dark. So these people had the opportunity to build a massive building. And then this is the view from up above looking down. So you can see the shape of the building. The dark lines are what are left today. And then the dotted lines and the slightly grayed out lines are sort of what archaeologists have discovered to be the outlines. And what you're seeing, let me get the highlighter here. Here are burials of people who wanted to be close to this. So it's almost like the idea of having a church where people want to be buried close to the church. Now, I do want to focus a little bit on these two items in the center. What these are, they were burial shafts. So shafts dug into the stone and then rooms down at the bottom. And one was a chamber with a woman's body. And then what you see here is a pottery jar, and it had the cremated remains of a man. And it's called a heroon, which is a hero's grave. At least that's what they're calling it. Clearly, it looks like this building was possibly the place where these people lived, or it was the center of a community. And they buried these two people here. Here's a close-up of the woman. And what you're looking at is sort of like a gold, it's sometimes called a gold bra, but it was set over her breasts, and it's gold. So clearly these people were wealthy. In the other chamber, you've got horses that were buried, probably to carry the two people into the afterlife. We also find some pretty interesting materials coming from this site. So some gold, some interesting pottery, things that aren't found in other places in Greece during this period. So what this is telling us is that in this particular area, there was trading. So throughout the Aegean Sea and Eastern Mediterranean cultures, so not everything was dark during this period. And the more archaeology that is done and published, it looks like it's less and less of a dark age. I mean, certainly it was if you were living in some of these major city-states that collapsed during this period, but not all was bad. And what we also know is that Athens and a few other mainland sites survived the Dark Age in terms of not totally collapsing. So that's really interesting. And then we get down to the next major time period in Greek history, which is called the Archaic Period. And it dates between 800 and 500 BC. And I had mentioned writing before with the Phoenicians. Now, during the Archaic Period, this is when you get some of the most famous writing from ancient Greece coming out. And this is Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Again, if we were taking this class in class, I would have us reading at least the Iliad. because it's really interesting. It can tell us quite a bit about culture, even though it was written in the 800s. The culture I'm talking about is like the Mycenaean period with the Trojan War. So writing makes its appearance with Homer. There's also other writers out there that we know of. I had mentioned aristocracies earlier. Some places, especially in Athens, you get the rise of an aristocracy, or the rule of the best. Now, I've got a couple, at least one word here, polis, the rise of the polis, and that is the city-state. So polis is a city, and you have probably heard of this word. There are lots of words that have carried down to us from the Greek. So if you heard of metropolitan, so metra means mother, and politan is polis, so the mother city. That's what metropolitan really means. So anyway, you've got the rise of a polis, which is the rise of a city-state. And remember, I talked about those before because you find them in the Mycenaean period, where you've got a separate government, separate economy, sometimes a separate religion, not so much in ancient Greece, because a lot of the Greeks followed the same type of religion. And you also find a large number of people moving around from Greece into the Mediterranean. We know a little bit about the government in this archaic period. So remember, in some places, not in all, but in some you've got kings, and these people are taken from the aristocracy. So sometimes you have kings, aristocracy, and then kings again, or just aristocracy. And sometimes, especially in Athens in particular, we know that there were counselors and councils to the king. There's a very famous one in Athens called the Areopagus. So Areos is named after the god Ares, who is the war god, and Pagos is hill. Hill. So you can tell sort of what these counselors are talking to the king about. If it's named after the god Ares, it's probably counseling about war and fighting. At some point, especially in Athens, you see these counselors becoming more powerful than the king, and that leads to the aristocracy, or the rule of the best. During this early archaic period, Athens seems to become the main city in Greece, and then it remains the main city until you have the rise of Sparta and some of the other large city-states that we'll talk about in class in a few weeks. I've already mentioned the polis, which is run by the council. Okay, in terms of colonization, so I'll show you a map here in just a second of where the Greeks had traveled throughout the Mediterranean. In fact, I think it's Plato who mentioned something about it's like Greeks around a pond when you look at the number of Greek sites that are found throughout the Mediterranean. So when you think about colonization, you need to think about why people actually move away from where they're living. And I put two things. There's internal pressure and external pressure. So in terms of internal pressure, you've got poverty. Now remember, we're talking about the Dark Age and moving into the Archaic period. So lots of poverty, famine, and so this would cause people to move. People don't tend to just sit down and die of starvation. They move where conditions are better. You also have this idea of freedom from societal pressure. So if you are low on sort of the society's totem pole, then you may get tired of that and you want to move and escape the pressure, the downward pressure on yourself. So you have internal pressures that cause people to move away. You also have external pressures, and usually that's the search for wealth, for fame, and it is tied a little to the internal pressure of society. So anyway, you've got those two big pressures. Now this map shows you where the Greeks ended up spreading out. So you've got Greece here. I'm hoping you can see my highlighter. In fact, let me see if I can find. No, I can't find a pen right now. Anyway, you've got Greece here, and then you've got all these sites in Italy, and you can see they spread all the way out here to the western side of the Mediterranean, as well as on the eastern side. So Greeks really spread out quite far. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but one of the things that happened with Greek colonization, which is really interesting, is that when you were Greek and living in Greece, and if you colonized other places, you kept Greek culture. You did not adapt to the surrounding culture until much, much later. And so the map that I'm showing you is the island of Sicily, so just off of Italy. And I want to show you a site called Agrigento. And I do want to make it clear that this site comes down to like the very late Archaic period, the early Classical period. So it's not like they left Greece and then instantly built this massive temple to the goddess Hera. But the idea, what I want you to remember is that when the Greeks moved from Greece, they kept their culture. And so a lot of the structures they were building look very similar to what they left behind in Greece. So this is a temple of Hera in Sicily. This is also a temple to Heracles or Hercules. And again, I give you the date. Again, it's a little bit later than the Archaic period. But what I want you to remember is that when the Greeks colonized other places, they kept Greek culture. And then up in the distance and then down at the bottom here is the Temple of Concord or the Temple of Peace in Agrigento. And then you've got, so the base of a temple for Zeus. And the Heracles temple, which I showed you, is in the background. So again, the reason I'm talking about the colonization and showing you sites in Sicily is just to let you remember that when the Greeks left, they kept their culture. And what I'll talk about in the next lecture is a little bit on the rites of passage, which is things such as marriage rights, birth rights, and so on.